Hi, everybody. This is the continuation. Uh, the settings were unadjusted, and what happened was it dropped when I was going over things yesterday. So I'm going to come back and go over this material once again. Let me get it set up for you. That is here. We're continuing on with our discussion. This is more or less the anatomy of the peritubular capillaries in the vas recta that you will see very, very shortly. I just have to go back and open this first PowerPoint that you can see here, and here it is. And we're going through, so I'll show you where I dropped. I was a little surprised because I'd spent a fair amount of time with this, but that's the way it goes. Now I have my computer back. Everything is doing pretty well. So you recall some of these, and now we start talking about the capillary beds that are so important with regard to this. Leading into the glomerulus. So these are the peritubular capillaries that are quite porous. They surround the cortical nephrons. The distinction with regard to cortical nephrons versus vasorecta, cortical nephrons are all about reabsorbing substances, whether it's glucose, whether it's electrolytes, whether it's nitrogenous wastes, and they reabsorb them, and then if necessary, they'll even reabsorb stuff that's going to secrete later. Where the vasorecta are pretty much there's only about 1/6 as many, and they're the ones that are into the medullary area, into those pyramid areas in the kidney, and they're all about concentrating the urine really more than anything. So they're pulling out water, and then to balance out the water that you pulled out because it becomes so concentrated at the sort of at the bottom of the vasorecta, you have to pull out electrolytes like sodium and chloride. So and that's the difference. So these are the vasorecta. They both come from the efferent arterioles, except one serves the cortical nephrons and one serves the juxtamedullary nephrons. And so that's the big deal. And there's some really great images. This is an actual micrograph that you can see, which shows you the intricacy. You can see the wider, and you can see the point to it, the afferent versus the narrower efferent. That gives you an idea. And those are really the elegant controls that if I didn't go over yet, I'm going to be going over again. They kind of auto adjust this whole thing, so you don't have to do a lot. Your kidneys basically work, and I say it all the time. It's the good news, bad news. They work great until they don't work. And so it's often a false sense of security. The same thing with respiratory problems, same thing with cardiac problems, with circulatory problems, with osteoporosis. It's fine, and all of a sudden it's a five-alarm fire. So we have so many backup systems and such a duplication of glomeruli. And it, probably if you were going to make a blanket statement, that's the reason we do annual checkups once you reach a certain age, or biannual or triannual checkups, because at least you can get some degree of an assessment. Is there something that's heading in the wrong direction, and how, if I can we correct it, or at least delay it, might be a better word. Here's this same illustration with the draped over peritubular capillaries and the long draped over vasorecta that you can see here. The key to the concentration of this is called the JGC, or juxtaglomerular complex. This is it. You have two sets of controls that work without you having to worry about it. One is measuring pressure of the blood that's flowing through, so it's auto adjusting your blood pressure. The other is measuring salt concentration. The pressure receptors are mechanical, the salt receptors are chemical. They're both in this complex. So this complex is located pretty much at the top of the nephron loop as it's going back to the distal convoluted tubule, and sometimes it'll overlap that area. You can even see it right by the afferent arteriole, and this is really a critical area. The macula densa is the chemical receptors. It senses salt. So you adjust if the salt concentration is too high or too low. It basically is altering blood flow into the glomerulus to make sure that if it's too concentrated, you retain fluid. If it's too dilute, you want to get rid of extra fluid, so it'll adjust blood flow. And the same thing that happens on the muscle side of it, the mechanical receptors deal with blood pressure. And what they do is, inside these so-called granular, or JG, or juxtaglomerular cells, they have tiny areas that secrete granules of this very important chemical, renin. And again, this is a system that's intimately associated with the blood So wherever these sensors are, blood vessels are draped over them. They secrete it. It goes right into the blood vessels and has an immediate response. Now renin immediately basically is a catalyst that changes something called angiotensin 1 to angiotensinogen, the precursor chemical. It's inactive, to a somewhat active form called angiotensin 1. And then later, as it circulates to your lungs, it becomes angiotensin 2. And that angiotensin 2 is just what its name suggests, angio vessels, tensions them. It tightens blood vessels. Additionally, it causes you to be thirsty, so you pull in more fluid. It stimulates antidiuretic hormones, so you hold in more fluid. More fluid in your system, the more likely your blood pressure is going to go up. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, it's always triggering the release of aldosterone from the adrenal glands. And the aldosterone basically inserts little openings, little channels into the collecting duct area. And those little channels basically induce sodium to be pulled back into the circulation. And where sodium goes, the old story, water is sure to follow. Einstein's Mary had a little lamb roll. Of course, love that. I just like saying it. So, and in between these two, you have a messenger cell apparatus called mesangial. And I don't know that it necessarily means messenger, but it's a neat way to remember it. And with gap junctions, so they can pass the signals between the two, so one can adjust the other. And they go into this in this complex, all the adjustments that are made. So here it is located right at the upper area. Let's say this is of the upper area of the nephron loop. Here you can see the sensor cells here that are chemical sensors. Here you can see the pressure cells. Here are the connecting cells. And they just adjust blood flow. And as you can see, we do a ton of this. 2.5 times an hour, basically, our whole circulation goes through our kidneys. We generate, as you can see, 60 times a day. We generate, on average, somewhere between 160 to 180 liters of this filtrate, of which we reclaim 99%. That 1% or less is what we basically excrete in our urine. Most of the stuff that we get rid of goes in the urine. Everybody. If you're taking medication, it's broken down. Typically, after it's used, it gets broken down in the liver. The liver makes it more water soluble. Boom, out in the kidneys. Some stuff we can blow away in our lungs, but the vast majority goes out in urine. And it doesn't matter what it is. A lot of waste products, that's what it's about. We lose fluid in other ways, like perspiration and things like that, and we utilize a lot of stuff. So we try to be a fairly efficient engine. But the urine, and basically that's what a lot of the processing is, making it more water soluble so it can be excreted easily. These are the three major events of kidney function: filtering, going through the glomeruli, either set. The vast majority, more than 2/3 of the activity, most of the energy is dedicated to the proximal convoluted tubules, where it resorbs 99% of the substances. And then finally, and most of this occurs in the distal convoluted tubules, it secretes. Yes, there's some overlap. We secrete in the proximal. We also reabsorb or absorb in the distal. But the vast majority of the work is done by the proximal convoluted tubules, and there's much more secretion sort of finalizing the urine. And I said it to you several times already, that we typically absorb stuff to create a gradient. So they have a lot of concentration, and then we can push the stuff out. And what happens is you get this interesting thing the body continues to do, which is create these symports and antiports. So when we're pushing something else, we can transport something else, sort of riding the wave. And when we're opening a doorway to push something out, we can bring something back in. That's called anti-transport. So we do that a lot biologically. It's again, it's the very efficient usage of the body. And it just shows you the different events that are here. The filtration, because it's pressure, doesn't require any energy. The membranes are adapted. So we have little openings called fenestrations that make stuff move in and out. We have a basement membrane that's really fused between two layers of cells. And we have these podocytes that open filtration slits, so it lets more out or less out. Just again, an analogy I used that didn't record. It's like in the old days when you had, like, it was called a dial-a-brew. It was a drip coffee pot where you can make it smaller if you only want to make 2 or 3 cups, or you can make it bigger if you wanted to go somewhere between 8 and 12 cups, like you're having company over. And so you would open or close the slits, so to speak. And that allowed to make the adjustment. And they're doing this from an actual micrograph. You can see the slits that are there. These are the podocytes. They adjust it. This is the Bowman's capsule, and so this is like the open area of the funnel. And here's the stem starting the proximal convoluted tubule. It's really good, and they've taken it from a micrograph. It's I've never been. I like this series of textbooks. We've used them for a long time. I've been using this series for more than 20 years at a variety of institutions. But the reality is, I like their illustrations a lot. I think they're very, very good. I frankly like the software that we used to get for free from McGraw Hill, but those were days gone by. Now they want you to buy those cards to get access to everything. And so, and they're just showing you some demonstrations of it. And really, it's tiny stuff that can filter through. Anything big, like macromolecules, starches that haven't been, for whatever reason, proteins, they can't get through it. They have to be small. So molecularly small would be an amino acid. The building blocks for proteins. So you have to break them down. And the same thing we absorb digestively. Glucose, which is a simple carbohydrate, just one sugar. Double sugars don't get through. A variety of nitrogenous waste, basically ammonia, and something called urea, which is ammonia with carbon dioxide. Water, certainly, etc. Everything else is held onto. The important role of the proteins is this: colloid osmotic pressure. And they go through all these slides here. Basically, what they're saying is your blood pressure very high in this capillary bed, more than twice as high as, say, a capillary bed in your hand or your foot or in your gut. Okay, so not a lot. So there's a high pressure system. Because it's high pressure, things flow out pretty aggressively. The blood vessels are designed structurally to put up with that increased pressure without, let's say, tearing. It's when the pressure gets excessively high or excessively low, that's when problems develop, or stuff gets stuck in there or it's damaged. That's the easy way to look at that. Then on the flip side of that, so to speak, the proteins are left. Proteins pull water. They tug. It's what colloid is. It's like having a glass of milk. It's proteins and water and fat. The reason it holds together and they don't separate, so when milk spoils, they separate. Okay, so the proteins, when they're functioning properly, hold on to the water. They develop a pull or a pressure. There's fluid in the capsule. That has a certain amount of pressure. But as you'll see, when they kind of, here's the distinction between the high 55 to normally 26. And when they do the math, and this is what it is, you have the blood pressure, okay, the hemostatic pressure, the flow of the blood, high. The oncotic, call it oncotic or osmotic pressure, pulling it back in, rather substantial, but still a difference of 25. And even the fact that there's fluid in here, another 15, net pressure 10, pushing stuff out. So it's not a whole lot different than a typical capillary bed. It's just run differently. And you can make adjustments in the diameter here and the diameter here. And what happens is you can either make blood, the longer blood stays in there, the more it circulates, the more fluid comes out. The quicker it goes through, the less. That's kind of the auto adjustments that you see. And so this is normal. When you do GFR calculations, and they go over this at the end, but I'll give it to you now. You'd have somebody collect their urine for 24 hours after you give them a substance. It was a polysaccharide called inulin. And inulin was neither metabolized or absorbed. It was excreted. So whatever you gave them had to come out, and you measured over 24 hours, theoretically all of it would come out. And you measure what you put in and what you put out. And there was a formula, and you could come up with this called GFR. Collecting 24-hour urines is sometimes necessary, but remarkably inconvenient. You have to go into something, collect it, pour it into a big thing, keep it someplace out of reach, and bring it back into the lab. Ugh. So nowadays, and I showed it to you on my blood tests, we do something called estimating it. And the estimate is not nearly as accurate, so we have a sort of an idea if it's over a certain number at a certain age. So let's say for somebody my age, if it's over 60 or 70 milliliters per minute, you go, hey, your kidneys are doing good. And you estimate that on stuff that your blood tests demonstrate. that are there. Mostly they're looking for levels of creatinine, and they're looking for levels of electrolytes, and looking for levels of blood urea nitrogen. So that's how they estimate it without having to go through all this jazz. So it gives you an idea if it starts to go down for whatever reason. And there isn't, and it isn't like, well, I went out for, I was at the gym and then came and had my blood test drawn. Different animal entirely, you know. So that's why we have certain guidelines for when people are, at least you have to inform the technician or the laboratory whether you ate something or whether you didn't. So a lot of this has to do with the pressure and the surface area and how permeable it is. And then these are the controls. Intrinsic or autoregulation dominate. As long as your blood pressure is not extraordinarily high or you're in shock extraordinarily low, because they work fine. So you don't have to kick in other mechanisms. Yeah, if we go into fight or flight, that's going to override it. If someone with an endocrine disorder or something that has triggered irregularities in the endocrine system, let's say a tumor or damage, that's going to throw things out of whack. And that's when you analyze these things from a medical standpoint to find out what's wrong. You look at all this stuff and say, not good, good. You know, that's part of what and I do not know. I have not done one of these in more than 20 years. This is called a workup. So you analyze the patient, and you go in and you discuss it with somebody and say, hey, we've got to do a workup on this. Meaning we have to get a bunch of blood tests and a bunch of scans and a bunch of X-rays and all that type of stuff. And sometimes you're doing it for a reason that you don't need to, and it's spending a whole lot of insurance money. So it's all the way that healthcare has altered over time. And it's different whether you're doing it in a teaching hospital, let's say at UPMC, where they do try to work things up a lot, or you're doing it at a local community hospital where you have to be concerned about how much money how much money is being spent, etc. Interesting dynamic. So here's the idea. Remember, we talked about MAP, mean arterial pressure. So typically 120/80, it's about 93, good range. Even if you're running a little, like my wife would be, I did the calculation before, would probably be around 77, like 110/60. Because she typically runs, and it's not a problem because her system is adapted. It's not, oh my God, something terrible is happening. But when someone goes into shock, like with their pressure is hardly readable at 100, it's probably half of 80, and then your kidneys are going to shut down and fail. Okay, or somebody with what's called malignant hypertension, 240 over 160, something like that. And it's way out of bounds. Something that doesn't happen to, they're going to have a stroke or a heart attack, some major episode. They're going to die, basically. So, and they go through describing these mechanisms. We're not going to go through that. Smooth muscle contraction is basically altering blood flow. If you want to pull water in, you hold on to you limit the blood flow. If you want to push water out, okay, you want to keep an idea of high blood pressure. You want to limit it going into the glomeruli, because once they tear or get damaged, now you have problems. Okay, so there's all. So, and again, dilation of afferent vessels. So if the blood pressure is going down, you want to tighten those blood pressures to hold on to the fluid, so to speak, is kind of what they're in. And then the ideas of working associated with the salt, we're not going to go into that. And then these are what I call overrides. Just the way that it's like something's going on, and you can't control something in the house, and you've got a switch. You can pull a circuit breaker. You can pull a fuse. Oh my God, something's going on with the oven, and it's electric, and somebody run down and do the circuit breaker. We don't have one on fire. Boom, that's an override. So this is kind of that kind of analogous situation. Sympathetic nervous system, they control the kidney. It's nothing parasympathetic. Parasympathetic may govern your heart and may govern normal times, but when the sympathetic nervous system controls blood vessels have nothing to do with parasympathetic. Therefore, they're the sole control of the kidney. So normally, the blood's flowing, autoregulation is working. But when something happens, fight or flight, vasoconstriction, ups blood pressure, constricting the afferent arterioles, we don't want to add to the point. We want to elevate. By doing that, so to speak, we're limiting urination Okay, we're limiting blood flow. We're preserving our energy for other areas where usually about 25% of your energy resources rest go to the kidney. And so we hold on to volume, we hold on to pressure because you're going to need it to do whatever you have to do. The big player is still this renin. It's the subtle adjustments of autocorrection. And the granular cells, now the sympathetic nervous system can do that. The macula densa cells can do that based on salt concentration. All of those, or we're not stretching, reducing the stretch on the granular cells. Those are all little episodes that can contribute to this. And the sympathetic nervous system uses all of them, as well as we use them when we're not in fight or flight. And I'm sure down the road you'll see again, without having to go crazy over this chart, all the things that can change it. All the things. So the renin-angiotensin mechanism, once it's activated to something called angiotensin 2, it will vasoconstrict, raises blood pressure, tightens the vessels, makes you thirsty, increases the antidiuretic hormone, and then the aldosterone, which is released here by the adrenal cortex, the outer portion, the adrenal glands, that will facilitate sodium reabsorption by putting little openings, little tiny tubules basically into the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct, and the water will follow, and voila, up goes blood pressure. And there's other factors that are there. Local chemicals, it's like caffeine. Adenosine kind of keeps things quieted down. When you block the adenosine, like I'm doing this morning when I'm talking to you, having a cup of coffee, the rate determining step is that will stimulate and potentially I'll feel the need to go urinate, that type of thing. And as many people do first thing in the morning. And we used to call it, the caffeine effect. So it does more than just wake you up and all those things. So there's a lot of interesting chemicals that are involved, and they go over this. This is the problem when people are not, and we really watch for this. Any of you going into a hospital environment, if you're going into nursing, if you're going to be working closely with patients, we call it I&O, input and output. You're always measuring these things. You want to make sure that the kidneys are working properly. Okay. And these are significant things. Is there some type of kidney reaction? Transfusion reactions, all the blood that sort of, remember their name was agglutination, clumps up. All those clumps, crush injuries certainly play a role in that. And that covers everything in that particular PowerPoint. So we move on. We're making good progress here. So this will be labeled YouTube or YouTube video number 2 from the date, which is 11/28. So I will move on to point B. Here it is. Should be, like I said, I'll move on to point B. Here it is. Voila. And so they go through some things here that are not that terribly important for us. Again, when I do my advanced phys class, and we'll go over this in the spring, we go over whether it's active or passive, and whether it's going through the cell and being processed, or it's going transcellular, means going through the cell, it might be processed. Paracellular sort of goes in between the cells. Again, not a big deal at all. And so how it enters and what it is and how it passes and all of those things, not terribly relevant. The bottom line is, as long as there's not damage to the area, it works properly. When too many things are going through that can't be accounted for, and that's why we look for signs. That's the whole idea. And we get to this at the end of the chapter. Why it's easy to dipstick the urine or to do a microscopic analysis to see what's going on. It's a quick, non-invasive test. It's easy. For years, that was the gold standard before. Remember, with diabetics, we didn't have glucometers that you can go to the pharmacy, or you go to Giant Eagle and you can buy and self-test yourself for everything, for ketones, for glucose, for everything. Oh no, we dipstick the urine, and that was a quick test. Be able to done for that. We use that all the time, and people would urinate and dipstick it themselves and cover themselves with insulin based on that before we had more advances technologically. And they're just showing you the different routes. We're not going to go through it. Not needed. Sodium is a big player here. And again, We transport it across the membrane actively, okay? And it gets pumped back in. And then it basically, again, what happens is we pump the sodium back in. It really, again, is the major conduit for water, and it creates, again, sort of flow patterns and gradients. Again, it's like waves coming into shore. It's not just water that's going to hit you in the shore, it's debris that's going to go in there. But the model here is that the sodium is going to pull other things along with it. And these are, so we're primarily active transporting the sodium, and then coming along for the ride, secondary active transport, or by facilitated diffusion, just bringing stuff close so it can be moved in, okay, results in different changes. And so what we begin, potassium leaks out of the cell, okay, and then more sodium gets pulled in. So what we begin to see is different things that go on. Typically, sodium and potassium move in opposite directions. The changes across the membrane result in electrical changes. And like I said, it's when the sodium is, because generally sodium is going in, potassium is going out. As potassium leaks out, and you might remember this, they may have covered this for you in AP1, it tends to pull more sodium back in to balance it out. So it's really that sodium movement is basically everything. So things that go along with it. Okay. The push, good word to describe it, for the transport of other things. Okay. Sugar, amino acids, these are all stuff we want to retain that are there. Not everything, certainly, but you're going to see what they're going to talk shortly about something called transport mechanisms, and it is an enormous player in diabetic problems. That's why there's so much, and we covered it a little bit when I talked about endocrine. When diabetics, you've got to be, and everybody's going to know somebody's a diabetic. While you're so worried about making sure their sugar is kept, we call them stable diabetics. Whether it's pills, whether it's diet, whether it's exercise, whether it's other lifestyle changes. I'll give you an example. Someone very close, effectively a part of our family, had quadruple bypass surgery. He's older than I am. Okay, he is a diabetic. He never took care of himself. He found out he was a diabetic. He hasn't altered his lifestyle. He had 4 bypasses. They nearly lost him. We were surprised that he made it. Okay, and even and as of yesterday, my wife told me, "Did you hear that this individual was all upset because his hemoglobin A1C was like at 9%. That's ridiculously high. That's someone who's totally out of control. Yet, I know that he hasn't altered his eating lifestyle at all. He just loves to eat desserts, and they're not low cal. Okay, let's just get it. They're all sugar-based desserts. So it gives you an idea of how important. So we're going to talk about that a bit with glucose. And that the more glucose you take and you utilize all of the secondary active transport, and it creates problems. Water is very significant. Again, sodium in the water follows. Water is basically pulled along because in most of these areas they have aquaporins, normal openings for water. They're always present in the proximal convoluted tubule. In the distal convoluted tubule and collecting ducts, it's a little bit different. Antidiuretic hormone inserts little, when that's activated, okay, like part of the things that angiotensin 2 does, that allows water to be absorbed additionally there. Okay, so creates concentration gradients for solids, which can drive their entry into a variety of things. Okay, so as water reabsorbed, it inside it's changing, it's moving the concentration of others. Some things can move. There are some fats and some ions and some urea can also move. So the big problem is this. Because of that, during the normal processes, certain things are problems because lipid soluble drugs you have to be very, very careful with, and environmental pollutants we have to be very. So there's inherently some problems that you try to control in what's being created in your system. It's not so easy to control. And again, I don't know enough about it to really to do a whole program about it. And they're showing a little bit of mechanics that are here, and I don't really want to go through it. And these are the transport maximums. Every substance has a limit, and the best model is glucose. So it's the number of available carriers that will allow that stuff to be brought back in and conserved. Okay, when all the carriers, when all those openings to bring back, let's say, glucose are occupied, then the glucose, when the term we always use, it spills out into the urine. That's one of the things we use to know. It happens and normally about 180 milligrams percent. That's excessively high. That's a high number. We want to keep diabetics under, even with difficulty, under 150 or lower these days. Because once it gets that number, now you're reaching what we call the transport maximum. Not only is sugar spilling out into the urine and pulling water along with it and creating a variety of other problems associated with diabetes, effectively out of control. Number two, it's altering the ability of those carriers to deal with the sugar. In short, that means, everybody, that those transporters become less effective. So once they get overloaded at 180, and if they're overloaded for, let's say a month or two at 180, all of a sudden their maximum goes to 170. Another couple of months it goes to 168, 166. And now effectively the diabetic is becoming less able to control. So the longer your sugar is high, the more problems it's creating for you down the road. So at least a high blood glucose that exceed transport maximum, and we get more spillage into the urine. The proximal convoluted tubule is where most of the shakes, the nutrients are typically absorbed, most of the water, most of the sodium, most everything, even the uric acid, which we have a limit for because the uric acid is designed to go out to a certain extent. We keep a certain amount, a really limited amount, like 8 to 12 milligrams percent, 6 to 10 milligrams percent, depending on the lab in our bloodstream. And the same thing with the urea. So the urea is the classic example of something to create we pull it back now to create a concentration gradient that can move other stuff along with it. The loop, the descending limb, the thin, which they call the thin limb, only water can move. The thick limb that ascends, water can't move. It's too thick for water to get through. But we can actively transport sodium and chloride. So and that's consistently there. Distal convoluted tubules and collecting duct, as I commented before, antidiuretic hormone when we need to retain fluid, fight or flight, when our body senses fluids are low, when angiotensin 2 is activated, the posterior pituitary releases this. It inserts these openings into areas into the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, and it just pulls water. Doesn't have anything to do with sodium. That's the aldosterone is the sodium. Same area, mostly collecting ducts, also the distal convoluted tubule. Sodium is retained. If we didn't have aldosterone active at all, we would lose sodium, and it's just you can't, because everything else would be all messed up between the sodium moving and the potassium irregularities associated. You would die. Simply say you die. And so it holds blood pressure and it allows potassium. Always sodium and potassium always move in opposite directions. When you have an overload, you might remember we talked about this, increased pressure in the atria of your heart, stretch receptors release atrial natriuretic, which means getting rid of sodium in the urine, natri for sodium, uritic to diurese or urinated out, and that will reduce some of it. So it's sort of governing the aldosterone a little bit, and parathyroid hormone also plays a role in that same area with regard to calcium. That's more about bone metabolism. And I think that's everything. Just about. The secretion is the opposite in the proximal, in the distal convoluted tubule, much more so. Even though it happens in the proximal, as you can say, it's almost always proximal. The distal is more finalizing stuff. Okay, potassium, acidity, ammonium ions, creatinine, all of these things. Okay, Substances synthesized in tubule cells are also secreted bicarbonate as well, because we're always playing with water with hydrogen ions and bicarbonate, so to speak. So even though it mostly happens in the proximal, the distal kind of takes care of it. There's a slide at the end, I suspect we'll end with. So substances, drugs, metabolites. That's why we test. You do urine testing for drug testing. As you know, sort of obviously there's some false positives and false negatives. That's why they correct what they call the B sample. So you have an A sample is dipstick, and a B sample is okay. Now we're going to run it through the machinery and find out what's really going on. Excessive potassium, urea and uric acid, controlling blood pressure with acidity or alkalinity that's there, and they give you an idea of what comes up and what goes out excessively. Okay, and then lastly, we get to this is all about the osmolality. I'll stop it here. This is called the countercurrent system. I'll do this in lecture to start. We're almost done with the kidney. And I'll do this in lecture to start. It's a little easier to understand because I can sort of point to the board when you're looking at me. And this would conclude today. So we'll do the multiplier and the exchanger. I won't go into it in great detail. We'll talk a little bit about more of what goes wrong and a little bit more about the urine. And we'll start in lecture and continue it in lab on Thursday, male repro. Thank you very much. And we'll do a dissection in the lab later. Goodbye. Thank you.